Hi everyone, thanks for being here. Public housing in Singapore, which is where I'm from, dominates the country's landscape. 80% of Singaporeans live in such housing, or HDB flats as we call them. Because of their ubiquity, and because their history closely intertwines with Singapore's emergence as an independent nation, perceptions of these flats are inextricably bound up with perceptions of Singaporean culture and identity. Just 50 years ago, most Singaporeans lived in shophouses, like those you see here, or wooden houses on stilts, like the ones here. Due to land constraints, most of these had to be demolished to make way for the flats. Towering blocks replaced low-rise dwellings. Efficient modernism replaced the messy vernacular. The HDB flats were thus a radical change, not just in terms of the visual and built environment, but also people's way of life. This gave rise to perceptions of the flats as devoid of culture and character. For instance, a Singaporean architect in 2004 lamented that, having disregarded most of the old and the existing, the city is left with no distinct visual identity, which is a serious deficiency in the formulation of Singapore's national identity. Yet today, the HDB flats are increasingly spoken of as a cornerstone of Singaporean identity, as this local journalist puts it. They've also become a popularly photographed subject in what this other journalist describes as a visual love affair. Singaporeans post countless pictures of the flats on social media, like this Instagram post, which describes them as having character, or this, which compares them to art. Hip local designer stores sell prints of the flats with idyllic descriptions and fancy dinnerware with HDB motifs. What accounts for this dramatic shift in perceptions of the HDB flats? The flats themselves have mostly not changed. Rather, the change lies in how they are portrayed. This magazine article hits on a grain of truth when it proclaims that we will look at HDB flats differently after seeing these photographs. Common to all these images that we've seen is their gridded composition, which has come to dominate recent portrayals of the flats, as is evident from these Google image search results. I'm interested in how the gridded composition functions, how it became a trend, and what stories it tends to tell versus what it leaves out. Art historian Rosalind Krauss writes that, in the overall regularity of its organization, the grid is the result not of imitation but of aesthetic decree. We can see this dynamic at work when we compare one of the gridded images to a street view of the same HDB block. The street view shows us the block as a whole and situates it within its broader environment. However, it feels rather pedestrian and visually unremarkable. In contrast, in the gridded image, our view of the block is organized into a pattern. Anything that does not fit is cropped out. We see only a section, not the whole facade, and we also don't see the back and sides of the block. In short, the gridded composition does not attempt to represent the block in its entirety, but instead ensures that what we see is visually attractive. Yet, even though we can't see the entire block, the repeating horizontals and verticals of the gridded composition encourage us to extrapolate that what we do see is indicative of the block as a whole, and even life within it. As Krauss puts it, by virtue of the grid, the subject is presented as a mere fragment, a tiny piece arbitrarily cropped from an infinitely larger fabric. It is thus that these slices of life transform the HDB flats as a whole from dull blocks into a place full of visual interest and character. Given the vast number of these images in circulation, it is impossible to pinpoint when and with whom this gridded mode of portraying the flats started. What is clear, however, is that the rise of smartphone cameras and social media has played a significant role in its popularization. To go back to our example, this Instagram image is by Singaporean graphic designer Ek Beng Chia, who, as he mentions in an interview, only embarked on street photography after he started using a smartphone in 2008. This other image that we saw earlier, also from Instagram, was taken by a Singaporean flight attendant, Yais Yusman, who has said that he only shoots on his iPhone. Both examples illustrate how the accessibility of smartphone cameras has paved the way for non-professionals to document their everyday surroundings, and how social media has given average individuals the platform to widely call attention to what they find worth noticing in the everyday. Cultural geographer Tim Edenser talks about how the everyday generates shared meanings, habits, and rituals that facilitate communication and establish a sense of national belonging. As the primary site of everyday life in Singapore, the HDB flats have provided the common ground for such shared patterns of everyday life to emerge. In the past, these patterns of life had largely gone unremarked upon. People did not generally take pictures of the HDB flats, much less circulate them publicly. When one did see a picture of the flats, it would probably be as a photograph accompanying an article in a newspaper, literally and metaphorically a backdrop. What smartphone cameras and social media have done is to help bring this backdrop to the fore, prompting recognition that the HDB flats are not the cultural voids they were once thought to be, but that instead, here lies a story to be told. Which brings me to my final question. What is the story of Singaporean life that these gridded images tell, or lend themselves to telling? Going back to Chia's photograph, the scene portrayed has distinctly pastoral qualities. The pastoral is a convention of landscape portrayal that romanticizes ordinary dwellings and ways of life. It's traditionally applied to scenes like shepherds or peasants in the field, but can also be used to analyze urban settings. Excuse me. Communications theorist Greg Dickinson specifically characterized the pastoral as conjuring notions of hearth and home and community, pioneering hard work combined with leisure, and nostalgia. Each of these qualities permeates Chia's photograph. Families are in their homes, windows are lit, a woman stands in the doorway, perhaps taking in the night air. The scene exudes a quiet warmth. The old block recalls older Singaporeans like my grandparents, those who, as popular narrative goes, are the pioneer generation, who saw the nation through its early years of independence. Chia's photograph paints a picture of life in these old flats as simple, peaceful, full of well-earned rest after a hard day's work. Little details mark this pastoral as recognizably Singaporean: the national flag, and the jumble of everyday objects peculiar to old HDB corridors like the potted plants, the shoe racks, and the laundry hanging out to dry. Looking at this image, I see not just a block of flats, but what is almost an archetype of Singaporean life. Archetypes resonate widely and tend to fix certain narratives in place. Likewise, this mode of portraying the HDB flats lends itself to promulgating set notions of what Singaporean life looks like. This image shows an example of this dynamic at work. It's a photorealistic illustration that serves as the cover for a book titled Living the Singapore Story, which was commissioned by Singapore's National Library Board in conjunction with the campaign to celebrate Singapore's 50th year of independence. We see the same gridded composition and the same pastoral tropes, but amplified. Instead of just one woman in a doorway, here we have people of all ages and from each of Singapore's main racial groups going about various activities on each floor. Leisure is explicit rather than implicit, as seen, for example, in the teenager tossing a ball in the air. The nostalgia inherent to the old block is further played up by details like the old man holding a birdcage, a nod to the once common pastime of rearing songbirds. Overall, this illustration portrays everyday life in Singapore as a good life, and Singapore's nation-building years as the good old days. This connection to the nation is emphasized by the predominant colors of red and white, which echo the Singapore flag, and the words, "Living the Singapore Story," blazoned across the image like writing on a page. The message of the image is clear. This is a portrait of the nation, a nation that is centered on the everyday lives of ordinary Singaporeans, a nation in which these everyday lives are harmoniously idyllic. Such images are precisely what Dickinson talks about when he writes that pastoralism provides aesthetically compelling images of individual, communal, and national identity. It is hard not to be entranced by the picture that such images paint of everyday life. However, there is also much that they inevitably leave out. First of all, they leave out the ever-changing present. As Dickinson puts it, these images constitute a walling off of the present, where the memories offered and engaged are not designed to open new possibilities or imagine new ways of making homes, but rather to create spaces in which there is a hope of return to a simpler and clearer past. As I mentioned earlier, these images often portray old. rather than new HDB flats. The crucial difference in newer flats is the absence of the long common corridors that form the basis of the gridded pastoral mode of portrayal. The older flats are being phased out, meaning that fewer and fewer Singaporeans will live in them over time. So in a sense, the HDB flats have finally come into their own in the popular imagination, only to become stuck in their past. Images like Chia's photograph, which was taken during the night, and the book cover, which is ultimately a fictive illustration made to look real, don't actually show us what the HDB flats typically look like on a normal day. In contrast, this photograph by Singaporean artist Dawn Ng is more reflective of the norm. It uses the same gridded composition and shows the same type of old HDB flats with the long connecting corridors. But the windows are dark, and not a soul can be seen. The block is empty, as it probably mostly is during the day, when people are out at work or at school. The image is less zoomed in, so the little touches of everyday life that made the other images so charming carry less weight here. The rows of flats look colder. The intrinsic extraction of the grid is laid bare. The words "everything in its right place" have been cut out of the photograph. The photograph exposes the careful mechanics on which these gridded portrayals of the HDB flats rely, namely, that everything stays within the pattern, that everything must fit. To conclude, the gridded mode of portrayal has, through its aesthetic appeal, helped to transform the HDB estates in the popular imagination. Its rise marks a ground-up validation of average Singaporeans' everyday lives and surroundings. Yet at the same time, this mode of portrayal lends itself to fixing and privileging set notions of what Singaporean life looks like, thereby eliding other aspects that don't fit the pattern or mold. This revisualization of the HDB flats hence cuts both ways, dynamically generating a sense of Singaporean identity that was once thought to be lacking, but also fossilizing it into a static still life. Thank you.